If you were unable to communicate with anybody, it would become very boring. Life would not be what it is. Why is life exciting, scary, and all the rest of it? Is because we communicate with one another. That's what we base our lives around. So, computers are no different. When you consider an operating system has tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of programs that make it, if they could only talk to themselves, you would have a very boring world. And in fact, it wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to have an operating system. So every operating system has an API, an application programming interface. Now, imagine me talking to 8 people. When I talk to 8 people, each one of those persons has a name. And I can address that person specifically, or I could address an entire group of people. It doesn't matter, but what I am doing is I am interfacing. I am communicating with those individuals. And likewise with operating systems, you have programs that can communicate with other programs directly by name, or they could communicate with several programs. And the way it does it is by interfacing with them, communing with them, asking them for data. And what we call this is an application programming interface, where programs talk with other programs. We have this conversation where we ask for data. We can also provide data as well. It's, again, just like a network. It goes one way and the other, just like human communication can go one way or the other. So let's take a look at a practical example. I have a fantastically simple operating system, and this operating system is going to have 5 programs. Now, when I address my friends, it's either oi, or more than likely, it's their name. So by addressing them by their name, that will allow me to communicate with that individual. Well, your programs also have to have names. That's so crucial. So each one of those programs is going to have a name so that they can be addressed. Now we're asking the computer a question. This is really important because how do we ask the computer the question is the magic. And it's called a console, and it's not a PlayStation or Xbox. The console is a text interface. Now if you can remember in the 80s and 90s, people didn't have graphical user interfaces, or GUI, however they want to call it, or GUI. It means the same thing. A graphical user interface allows us to interface with graphical components. So buttons and scroll bars and a cursor where you can click and drag, and menus that you can click on a menu item and so forth. All of these things are graphical components. So we are interfacing with graphics. We're interfacing with graphical components. But the opposite side to that is the fact that we have another type of interface called a console. And originally, computers didn't have GUIs, or graphical user interfaces. They had console interfaces, very simple text interfaces. So if you can remember those old computers, what people used to do was they used to type in a command. There was no cursor, there was no clicking buttons or whatever else. It was just type in a command and then hit return. And when you hit return, you'll either get an error or you'll get some output. So that's what a console is. A console in computing is simply a text-based interface. It's one of the simplest interfaces because it just consists of text. And I could directly type into this console, go ahead and fetch me the font program. So we're targeting a person, an individual at this point. And what we're doing is we're saying to this person, please give me a list of all the fonts installed on the computer. So I provide it that information. What am I asking that program to do? So we've called the program and we've asked the program to do something. Once you hit return on that statement, that's a command that you have given the computer, you hit return in the console window. The console says, right, the receptionist springs up out of a chair, goes and runs and finds the bloke called font. And she goes, excuse me, could you go ahead and fetch all of the list of fonts that are installed on the computer? Now, when that happens, it'll go either yes or no, or that's not the right way to say it. However, it was the right way to say it. So what it does is it goes ahead and fetches out of the file all of the fonts installed on the computer. It hands it over to the receptionist, and the receptionist comes back to the desk, and then she hands over that data to the individual. So when you look at it in that sense, what we have here is a front desk. We have a place to go where we can ask questions. And that's exactly what a console allows us to do in the most basic form. Now, if you think about it, a graphical user interface does not let you do that. You are at the whim of the individual who programmed that application. And that's not a bad thing. You do need graphical user interfaces. But what happens when you want to ask a question like, how many fonts are installed on the computer? Well, you can't do that through a graphical user interface unless that graphical user interface gave you a button to say, fetch all the fonts. You can have a graphical user interface to do that. But what if you just wanted to just very quickly ask this question? Do you have to go off and install third-party software in order to get the fonts installed on your computer? No. What you can do is pop open a console window. So with every operating system, they do have console windows, such as with the Windows OS, it's called the command prompt, a console window, a text interface that allows you to input commands and receive output in the text format. And then also for macOS and also for GNU/Linux, you have the terminal. It's exactly the same thing, whether you want to call it a command prompt or a terminal, it's a console window. And this console window lets you input commands, and it also lets you receive the output of those commands in a basic text format. It's nothing special, it's not a major graphical user interface, it's just a way of asking your operating system directly some questions. And don't forget, your console can also access other applications that you've installed as well. So if you, let's say, add in another third-party program into the operating system, so the operating system can go and fetch that third-party program through the console window, and it can ask that third-party program a question and receive an output. So it's not just only the applications that come with the operating system, it's also third-party applications. And you can still write console applications today. In fact, they're incredibly useful. But that's a whole nother topic. What I want to talk about right now is the fact that you can have an external API and you can have an internal API. Now think about it like this. What I did was external. I asked the console, the front desk, to go and fetch a program, and then I asked that program a question. But note, I asked the program a question itself. Just like if I ask you, you are external, a question, you can think in your own mind. Meaning, you can, let's say, think over a complex equation that I've given you, work out such and such, and your mind will start to talk to itself and try to figure out the mathematical equation that I've given you. Well, likewise, you can ask the individual program a question. So if I just called the program, that's an external API. But the application itself has its own API. So consider this. I've asked this font program to tell me how many fonts have been installed. Now, what it needs to do is it needs to go and check the font directory. The font directory contains all the font files. So what we've done there is we've called the program externally via the console, and now we've asked the font program the question. Now the font program's got to think in its mind, what do I need to do? Well, what it needs to do is it needs to go and fetch the file reader program. So it's going to run a function and it's going to fetch the file program, and the file reader program is going to read all of the font files installed on our computer. It's going to give us the font names back. So we've now got another layer of communication. Now when that goes back to our font application formats it in a very nice way so it looks really nice. And then what it does is it takes that list and it hands it back to the console. So we have this whole chain of APIs. And don't forget, applications in and of themselves can request other applications. So you can have applications that think for themselves. Likewise, if I had a maths application, and let's say I called the maths application from the console, and I started giving it complex equations. Well, for each one of those equations, we could have a function to deal with that. And then, of course, the program is thinking inside of itself, and then trying to come up with the answer. And then when it's got the answer, it's going to give it back to the console. So you can see, just like human beings can communicate externally and they can communicate internally, thinking inside of their mind, programs can do the same thing. You can communicate externally with another program, and also a program can communicate with itself, an internal API. So you have two different types.